Thanks for joining us for another episode of DPC Radio. This episode was recorded live in Amsterdam at the Dutch PHP Conference 2012. For more information about the Dutch PHP Conference, visit our website, phpconference.nl.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the PHAR, the PHP executable format. Hopefully everyone is hungover from the social from yesterday. Did everyone go? Yeah, only a handful of you. All right, fantastic. Money well spent. I like it. So my name is Helgi. I'm this fellow over here. I co-founded Orchestra.io, PHP platform as a service, so we can host your PHP applications. We got bought by Engineered, the company that actually sponsored the social and a few other things here. We do PHP and Ruby. I'm a paired developer. I'm from Iceland originally, but I live in Dublin. And if you want to hackle me during the talk, just tweet me at H, and I'll try to reply to you if my tweet stream allows. It gets a bit hectic at times. So I want to talk to you guys about what is PHAR. Have you guys actually heard about it or used it before? Hands up. Good few people. Awesome. Fantastic. All right, so PHP Archives. PHAR is PHP Archives. So it's similar to jar files, but for PHP. If you guys have used jar or Firefox specifically, most of the plugins are jar files. So originally there was a PHAR library called PHP Archive, and it was a reference implementation. It was done by one of my coworkers, Davy Shafiq. He's here at the conference, actually. And it's userland code, it's PHP code. It is less powerful than the PHP extension that's now available, but it works for older PHP versions. 5.1, 5.0, 5.2. And the biggest problem with it, it's not maintained anymore. But now there's the PHP extension, like I mentioned. It is built into PHP 5.3 by default, and is way more powerful, just by the fact that it's a PHP extension. So after a bit of back and forth, we managed to get it in to 5.3 by default, and it's on by default. And that's really the power of PHAR, is that for most systems out there, it's going to be available to you. So if we kind of unravel a little bit what PHAR is and getting kind of into what the format itself is about, it's a simple yet flexible file format. You can pack multiple files into a single file. So it's really similar to tar, but it has a special sauce to it. So this is the file format, specifically as it is laid out. If you actually would open up the file in a text editor, a PHAR file in a text editor, you would see this kind of structure. It is a binary format as such, but you can still read most of it. So at the top, you'd see a stub file, and I'll explain what a stub file is. But there's a manifest file, similar to what you would see in a zip file or a tar file, explaining what files are in there. And then the file contents would be then listed out. And then there's this optional signature. The signature would be to verify that no one had tampered with your file. Basically a SHA-1 kind of hash of your whole archive. So let's talk a little bit about the manifest and why there's kind of small bits and pieces to it that are really cool and can be really useful. Like I said before, it is a list of files. If you have a.php, b.php, and so on in your project, it will be listed there. But the cool thing is, it has file permissions. It will maintain the file permissions that you put in there. There's file compression, so you compress each individual file. But a really useful feature is that there's metadata in there as well. So you can put metadata per file or per the whole archive. And I've seen people actually put auto-loading maps into the metadata, where they make the autoloader fetch into the metadata of the archive, pull it out, and then they basically have a PHP array of the whole autoloading map. So there's a lot of performance boost in that. So you can do whatever you can think of with the metadata. So if you talk about the compression, you can compress the whole archive or individual files. Why would you want to compress individual file versus the whole archive? If we're thinking about PHAR is really similar to tar, and you go, okay, but in this one you can compress individual files. And the fact is compression and uncompressing can be slow. But there are specific files. If you think about the send framework, there are translation files in there, big XML files. There are translations and localization and so on that you specifically wouldn't want to burden the user with because the size is so large. But these are just text files, so they're really easy to compress down, and you only need to uncompress them at specific time, and you read them into memory. So you can compress specific JSON files, XML files, and things that actually need compressing. And the available compressions are Gunship, BC2, and zip files. And this is independent of what's installed on your system as a PHP extension. So you don't have to have the PHP zip extension compiled in and enabled for the zip to work with PHAR. So you can define which compression method you actually use. So, but really the cool thing about the PHAR and what makes it really flexible are the stubs. And what are stubs? They're a piece of PHP code, and you can use it to bootstrap whatever is in the PHAR file, or you can use it to autoload things. And what that means is that you can actually take something like phpMyAdmin, create a stub file or a bootstrap file, put phpMyAdmin into the PHAR file with this helper kind of stub, and it will just, phpMyAdmin will run like it's running not in a PHAR file. It will be no wiser of what's happening. So basically, you're using the stub file to bluff what is happening. And I'll show some code examples of both how to create PHAR files and how this whole thing functions. So there's code online, and I will be adding more code to this after this talk, but there's a bunch of code up there already of most things I'm about to show. And I'll show this link at the end again, but if you guys are interested in playing around with some of the things that I'm talking about, I have some basic examples online. Any questions so far? Any thoughts? No? Still tired from the lunch? All right, fine. A PHAR file in compiled code. I don't know. You would have to ask the maintainers, which are somewhere. Or we would have to get more maintainers. It's just one. I don't think there will be much possibility of that in general. But if you can convince someone to do it, probably. Elizabeth Smith outside. Or Davey, actually. So, going a little bit onwards from here. So, this is a normal include. In all my projects, I have awesome.php, of course. It's my bootstrap file. But what I could do with PHAR, I create a PHAR file that includes my awesome.php, and I can use streams. Because PHP has PHAR built in by default, and it's also available through streams, that means that I can take a PHAR file and include files from within the PHAR file without having to extract it. So what it means here is that I created a project.phar, and in there's awesome.php. So it's like I'm reaching into an archive, compressed file, essentially, and going, hey, I want to include this. And PHP just goes, all right, fantastic. This is a stream. I understand this. Let's do it. So the most important bit there is that the fact that PHAR actually works with streams, not just includes, but with just about anything. Anything that works with streams, it can use. fopen, fwrite, fclose, file get contents, open directory, remove directory, and so on. Anything that streams can do, you can operate on a PHAR file the same way. One of the best examples of that would probably be if I had a PHAR file that contained my assets. Let's think about if I was Drupal and I decided I'm going to make all my plugins into PHAR files. And so we as users would download those PHAR files and just drop them into a location. And obviously each plugin or even a theme would have different assets and different PHP files. And the project could actually be fetching all these files like that. So in here, I'm just setting the header so I can actually then echo out the septo.js. And this kind of gives you the power to bundle things up and just hand to the user or hand to your customer bits and pieces or even whole applications. So by default, it does not extract to disk unless PHAR is not available. However, I did have one person earlier on come up to me and tell me, well, it actually does extract to disk, but it only happens when, by default, it will extract into memory and operate from memory, which is why it's fast. However, if you manage to overload the memory, it will start swapping, putting things onto disk. So my reaction to that is you're probably doing something wrong at that point if your memory is anyway getting overflown. So by default, PHAR will operate from memory as much as possible. So there's no I/O on the disk or anything like that. It's just the initial read. So the other cool bit is that it works on the web and it works on the command line. So it actually has helper functions to deal with that kind of stuff. And it can be ran without the extension. There's a default stub that you can use that actually handles things. If you don't have the PHAR extensions installed, it will extract to disk then at that point and kind of operate from that space. And I'll try to show you that default stub later on. But it tries to kind of help you, even when the PHAR is not available, it will try to help you as much as possible to still be able to actually use the PHAR file. So obviously, there's no point in talking about using the PHAR files without knowing how to create the PHAR files. So with the PHAR extensions, there are two ways to do it. And if you go to my GitHub repo, I use this approach for these specific examples. So it's a command called build from directory. So you just pass in a directory, and it will just include everything from there, and basically create a PHAR file from that structure. And here is the basic example. So up here, you're just making sure that PHAR can actually write to disk. By default, it doesn't because PHAR is in read-only mode by default. This is for security. So you, as the maintainer of a PHAR file, you either have to change your INI setting or just pass in -D to override that specific setting on the command line, excuse me. So over here, we're creating a new PHAR object, and we're saying save this file into project.phar in this location, and internally we're telling it this is your name. This is the name that you should be referencing yourself by and whatever you're using it. And over here, I'm telling it the path to my project, just build from this directory. And if I want any specific stubs to kind of bootstrap the project, I pass that in and do set stub, and then we're done. And that's it. That's the only thing you need to do. This is the simplest case, but what if I want to point to a directory and I don't want all the files? You can actually pass in, as the second parameter here, you can pass in a regular expression that does, I want it just to get like .php files or these specific files. Whatever you can do with regular expressions, you can put in there and do, I want these things. But that's not really flexible. It's not really fun writing some regular expressions to kind of pull in only specific files. So PHAR has another method called build from iterator. So that allows you to basically use any of the PHP iterators that work with the file system and only pick out specific files based on that, because the iterators are just so much more flexible. And here's the example of that. As before, we have the PHAR example here at the top. We're including that. And then build from iterator. In this case, I'm doing something kind of funky, and I'll explain that in a bit. But here's the thing. We use the recursive iterator to kind of initialize the iterator function so the PHAR file actually has something to work from. And in this case, because the PHAR class itself is extending directory iterator, it means that we can actually reference another PHAR file. So we can make a PHAR file pull from another PHAR file to build like this super PHAR file. But it can be whatever you want. It could be just a normal directory iterator that goes, I only want these specific files or exclude these specific files. So whatever you can do with iterators to kind of build up what you want, you can then just pass into build from iterator, and voila, it's there. So you have a lot of flexibility in terms of what you're pulling in. Everyone on the same page? Everyone understanding? All right, silence is yes. Let's call it that. The second parameter here is to make sure that anything you pass in through the iterator, it strips this portion of the path off. The reason for that is that the iterators, by default, they will give you full paths. And with PHAR files, you don't want full paths. Otherwise, it's kind of like I create a PHAR file and give it to one of you guys, and your system is not laid out the same way, and it goes, derp, 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 I have no idea what's happening. You know, it just explodes. So you kind of have to strip things off. And this is just the easy way to do it when you're dealing with an iterator. Just strip this off for me. So going a little bit further on to kind of stub files, when we've created the initial PHAR files based on these kind of directories, now we need to start doing something with the actual stub files. A good example of that is an autoloader. So in the examples that I showed you guys before, at the bottom I had set stub, right? So this code would go in there. What it does is it registers an old school underscore underscore autoload, and we're actually telling it, oh, include from within the PHAR file, and the underscore file underscore is actually the PHAR file itself. So you're actually just telling it, oh, include from within yourself. Great. And then you have halt compiler, so it's not trying to actually compile the rest of the PHP code that's in the PHAR file. So you're just telling it, stop now. So with this one, you can actually run a PHAR file from the command line, and it will start auto-loading from within itself without a problem. Here's another auto-load example. Class A invokes class B, and they both echo things out. And here's a really good example of something you do with a framework. If you think about Silex or Lithium or any of these frameworks that provide you with a PHAR file, if you're a framework, you could just create a small autoloader stub file and include the file directly, not even as a stream, just directly as a file. And since it's a PHP file, PHP won't choke. It'll just go, oh yeah, I understand this stuff. Let's do something with it. So you include it, and suddenly you can start including class A that we were creating here before. You can now include it here without having to do anything. You just include this initial PHAR file, and boom, you have access to the whole of Symfony, whole of Silex, whole of Send framework, whatever it is that you packaged up or you're trying to use. So even from that perspective, it is quite handy when you're dealing with frameworks and you just have to include this one thing and it handles the rest for you. However, there's a few gotchas, and anyone that has had to use a PHAR file, for example, I've had to maintain a PHAR file, Pyre's PHAR file, Niles, that's giving a talk later on about Composer, he's had some problems with PHAR files as well. There are specific things, there are bugs. For example, detect Unicode, if it's on, it will start giving you all these question marks. And it's because we're still not sure what it is. It's either a problem in PHAR or detect Unicode, we're not sure. Probably detect Unicode, yes. So there's a problem somewhere on the internet that causes this, let's put it that way, and it's not been tracked down or fixed. So when you start seeing output like that, it's not good. So the other big one is APC now has the ability to enable itself on the command line, and it's only supposed to be used for testing purposes or whatnot. For some reason, this chokes up the PHAR files as well, which is kind of unfortunate because PHAR files on the web, when you're using a website, it actually works with APC just fine. So if you're, for some reason, you have enabled CLI on and you're doing something with PHAR files, it just won't work. So there are some gotchas that you have to kind of be aware of, but unfortunately, These are kind of hard to deal with. So why use PHAR? There's a few reasons to use a PHAR, and these are the most common ones. Command line applications, such as Pyrus or Composer or PHP Unit, indeed. PHP Unit is distributed now with PHAR files as well if you want them. So it means that I can have PHP Unit 3.5 and 3.6 living side by side. So that means if I'm developing multiple applications over the course of 2 years, and I've been switching between all these PHP Unit versions because, let's face it, Sebastian just doesn't like to keep compatibility. So I need all these files. So if I go to a client that something I developed 2 years ago, and he goes, this is breaking, I'm like, okay, I'll run the tests. And it just happens to be that my tests are one version behind PHP Unit from what I have on my system. It wouldn't work. But with these PHAR files, I can actually maintain multiple of them at the same time and just go, all right, I'm just going to run this PHAR file against that project. Fantastic. Web applications, you can, like I said before, PHPMyAdmin, Drupal, whatever you want. You can create your own website, and you can actually serve it from a PHAR file. Setup tools. Setup tools like, so if anyone has ever had to install PHAR at any point, go to the website through GoPHAR, like go-phar.phar, then you're using one of those setup tools that I wrote. Also, if you've ever compiled PHP in the last 4 years, and you had with PHAR on, you were using a PHAR file. You just may have not known it. We actually started distributing PHAR files with PHP way before anyone else did, because we were actually using, or still are using, the implementation that Davey wrote. So we've actually managed to ship it for a long time, and that means that the PHP maintainers just have to pull in one PHAR file from me when I tell them, hey, I have a new version, instead of dropping a bunch of code onto the system. So we use it to actually set up things like PHAR, or you can use it to set up other utilities that you have if you need to install something on the system. So it's a handy little container that you can hand your clients. Hey, use this. And then suddenly, boom, stuff is on the system. And you can make the setup tools. The cool thing is you can make the setup tool work on the command line and the web interface with the same PHAR file. And that's what we started doing with the GoPHAR one as well. We just never finished. You can use it for plugins and themes, such as in Drupal. You can use it for libraries like Silex, Lithium. Lithium actually uses PHAR plugins, last time I checked. So you can do a lot of cool things with it. And it kind of shows that, wow, holy crap. It kind of shows that the need for these kind of formats, because users today, they don't want to be installing either too much on their system, or they want to have the ability to switch between versions really easily. And in PHP, we just never provided that really for people, beyond actually just dropping a big PHP file to them, which is never really fun. So let's talk about the pros and cons a little bit. The pros. The user only has to download a single file. That is always really handy. They just download a single file and use it. A lot of people like that. Like I said before about the PHP Unit stuff, you can run multiple versions of the same thing in parallel. So I can actually go, oh, there's a new version. I'll just download that and run that in isolation. I don't have to throw away my old version just in case I need to go back and use it because the new one has a horrible bug. And I think some people here may have experienced that with PHP Unit. I think 3.6 had a bad bug, and people were trying to downgrade to 3.5, and it was just not possible, and things like that. Like these kind of PHAR files will just eliminate that. Upgrades are easy enough anyway. You just download a new file and override the old one, or download a new one and name it differently. No unpacking. You don't have to actually click and extract something and do fancy stuff with. A lot of users hate that. Security, there's a moderate security against modifications in the sense that you can actually check the integrity of the files. You can do it programmatically as well. But there are cons. There are always cons with great things. There are no incremental updates, as in I can just publish a delta of the file as like a small patch, and people just update based on that. You have to give them the full version all the time. While upgrading is an easy process in terms of downloading, it's still now a manual process unless you start inventing some systems around it. If you have a CMS, it becomes a lot easier because you anyway need to create a system that's making sure everything is up to date, but still. Web servers need a change. Only in the sense that you just need to tell Apache that this .phar file is actually a PHP file. And you can actually name phar files as .php if you want to as well, to simplify things. Extending an application becomes a little bit harder. It's not like you can just suddenly go in there and start modifying code left and right without causing some problems. And the README and install files will probably be within the phar file, not accessible to the user. So that's a bit of a problem, but at the same time, the whole point of the phar file is there's no installation. So there are pros and cons, things that we still haven't really worked out because, frankly, there's not as many people using phar files as I would want. So there's not enough momentum yet. So we just need to create a momentum and start complaining about all the bugs, and maybe someone will listen.
How about IDEs? Is it possible to have code completion in a phar file and distributing a library? And considering phar, this is an important issue.
So the question was, if I have a phar file, can my IDE actually start auto-completing the library that is in the phar file? Honestly, I've not tried it. Pretty sure no, because it is a specialized format as such. So they couldn't understand it. But for example, I would say the PHP Storm guys, the JetBrains guys, if you just went to them and said, hey, I want this, they would probably go, no problem at all. Because really, it is just a PHP file. So the only thing that needs to happen is they need to read through the file contents and then run like a lexicon on it to just extract all the information required. So it's not out of bounds, but no one does it right now. So it's kind of we'll probably have to talk to the IDE people before that happens, unfortunately. Any other questions so far? So the question is, if the phar file is not around, can I somehow limit the memory that's being allocated to the phar file? It will use as much memory as your PHP installation allows for, since it's built into PHP. So if you say, hey, you only have 32 megabytes of memory, then it will use that. So it doesn't break out of the PHP boundaries. Does that answer your question? Cool. Okay, go for it. Mm-hmm. So the question would be, if you use something like Send Framework 1, which already has require once files in there, will it execute it again? Is that? No. So the thing is, with phar files, because again, they're part of, if you create the correct autoload class, no, actually, it just won't work.
Send Framework 1 strips those out when building the file, when you build a file as a script for it to comment out the requires.
Yeah, so I guess what it boils down to is that if your code has require once, it can't adapt itself to these different scenarios. And like he was saying, there are scripts that can strip the whole thing out, and you create your own autoload stuff. Potentially, I have actually not tried it, but I would still recommend stripping them out and using an autoload. But you could potentially use it, but now that I think about it, just never occurred to me, actually. That's a good point. Yeah, so potentially what my good man over here is saying is that we might be able to use include paths in the stubs to solve these problems, as much as using the autoload and stripping things out. And that is actually a fairly viable option. Unfortunately, myself, I've not tried it, so I can't vouch for it, but it sounds like it could work. Unless anyone else has a different opinion on that? No? All right, that works. Fantastic. Now, it's a good point. It's a good point. Like, you can play around with the include paths, and again, since it's just normal PHP, there's no reason why it wouldn't necessarily work, because you are telling it, hey, the path that you should be looking in is in the FAR file. As long as you strip everything else out, so it's not trying to look outside the FAR file as well. So, a few more stubs. Let's talk about a few more of the cool stubs that you can use, and I'll actually attempt to show you some examples in the browser and the command line as well. So, a bootstrap for FAR, this is the minimal version that you can have. So, it's the usual new FAR and the name of the FAR file, and then you just say halt compiler. Not sure why it's not just built into FAR, as in this always needs to be the last thing in the stubs anyway. But you need to have halt compiler as the last one, so it doesn't try to execute any of the other PHP files in there just by accident. So it is a minimum requirement. But stub files are not used when you're using streams. So stub files are only used when you're including directly and not through a stream, and when you're actually running things through the website or like the browser or the command line with an actual binary. So with streams, stubs are not there. And that's kind of important to know. So in this example, it's a web-only FAR. What happens here is that FAR has some convenience functions that you need to know about. FAR intercept file functions. This is what makes the whole fopen, file get contents, and all that kind of actually work. It is actually intercepting all the file functions and redirecting them appropriately to go into the FAR instead of trying to look into some weird paths. Munch server is a web-only thing. As you can see, web FAR, so you're telling it this is actually a web FAR. But Munch server is actually fixing up, in this case, request URI, PHP self, and script file name. So it's actually trying to fix things so your scripts will actually still function as normal, like it would be ran outside of the FAR file. And I'm going to actually do something brave here and attempt to show you guys some examples. All right. No. Oh, fantastic. It's kind of there. Yes. So this is a FAR file that I created from that specific example that we had. And in the web.php that web FAR actually was including, what it did is it's just a dump of the server superglobals. So as you can see, it's running just fine as a web thing. And at the bottom here, you can see PHP self that we messed around with, the script name, the request URI. We kind of fixed it up so it actually functions like normal. Otherwise, if you don't do that, it will expand the path in a different way, and your application will basically go, I have no idea what's happening. This is just like, I've never seen this before. Huzzah! So as you can see, not a heck of a lot of colors, unfortunately. And it's not blinking because, I don't know, the web doesn't work. But as you can see, this is just a normal PHP file, and it's functioning just fine in the browser through the FAR file. Now, if we just jump really quickly and go on to a few more examples. So in this case, I explain what the intercept file function did, munch server, and the web FAR. They're all responsible. You need all of these to make it work on the web, right? But if you go back here, if I try to run this on the command line, it will actually not go past, like it will get down here, but the web version only stops here. So if we go back to why is it not outputting? Demos never work when they're supposed to work, do they? Well, at least it's not outputting anything. So your website is not being outputted through the command line. Let's put it that way. So it is supposed to get below there and start doing the echo for me, but unfortunately it didn't, which is unfortunate indeed. So the combination of these, but this is the command line example, and it's vastly simpler. You only need intercept file functions and some sort of an include to a script that potentially would operate specifically for your command line, bootstrap it, or you can just add it directly in here. And I put a shebang thingy here at the top that should work just fine. And maybe this time the demo gods will be more favorable. Aha! So this is essentially the same thing where I'm dumping out the server variables, but through the command line. So fairly simple, but at least this one worked. Quite happy about that. So CLI.php just contains, again, server dumps. So there's no web FAR, simple include, and shebang for easy execution if you really want that. But here's a combination script that tries to combine both of them. So we do the usual web FAR stuff first, and then we just include the CLI at the end. And I'm going to show that off as well. See how brave I am. No, not this one. There we go. This would be the combo. This does CLI stuff. No, this does not do CLI stuff. CD combo. The first one was right. So in this case, let's FAR read only. This is what I was talking about. When you're the FAR creator, you always have to either pass in the read only equals 0 to disable the read only, and this can only be done in the INI or through the command line. This cannot be done through INI set, so people cannot actually exploit your code and attempt to modify the code. So this is kind of a security for that. You can obviously change that in your INI. All right, so now this is what I was going for. This was not working before, but now this is the web stuff, but it has the CLI option as well. Again, a dump, really simple stuff, just proving it works. And in here, this is the command line stuff. This does CLI stuff, even if it has web options in it. So they're just echoing out, and just to kind of prove I wasn't gaming that in any way, shape, or form. This is the web.php that ran on the browser. And you can see this does web stuff, even if it's CLI. And this does CLI stuff. So there I just created a combo FAR file. And I find that kind of intriguing because now I can start creating setup tools that either work on the web browser or the command line, depending on how prepared the user is to either drop into the command line or they want to use the browser. So, oh. No. Yeah. So the question was, if you're in CLI mode, will the web PHAR actually be executed or not, or will it just skip past it? And it will skip past it. That's the whole point. So the first example that was attempted to echo out and didn't work, no idea why, because the include here just worked fine. It worked great. So the web PHAR, it will go, oh, am I in web mode? And if it's not, it will actually just bail out as early as possible. Otherwise, it actually has a bunch of routes for you and helper functions. So apparently we're running a little bit out of time. So here's another really simple CLI plus autoloading, where you intercept the file functions, do the autoloading, and then do something CLI specific. Again, really similar example from before. CLI.php will then include A, which includes B, that then echoes things out. So it allows you just to do the similar kind of includes and then start doing stuff below it. Whatever CLI.php is. It could be Composer, it could be, I don't know, something fancy. Your new awesome project that your boss is going to love you for. So there's a default stub. It will work for most, so you can actually just say, this is the default stub, this is the CLI, and this is the index.php. And if you want to see what it looks like, you can use get stub. But I'm going to be brave again. And I am going to show you that stuff. Oh, God. This would be the default stub. Yeah, it's a lot. What it does is that it will try to do the web stuff for you, intercept everything, figure out where it is, and then it will actually have its own MIME types. It will have its own router if it's trying to figure things out. It will just take care of a lot of things, but it may not fit your use case, but it's still good. Oh, yeah, so it did. Yeah, you're right. All right, you were right, man. Fantastic. Something I didn't realize. So it will also try to use all the different kind of extracting functions, because what it's trying to do for you is, if the PHAR extension is not around, it will start trying to extract for you onto disk so things will still work. They will just work from a temporary location. So it has a lot of these like, oh, is this extension enabled or that extension, and so on. And it will bail out if the right things are not available. So this is the default stub that kind of most people can use. Yeah, like I said, extracts to temp directory if not available. But now let's go on to the performance, and since we don't have much time, let's kind of speed it up a little bit. It does work with APC. So if you're on the website, it can actually work on files from within inside the archive and do opcode caching on those files. Why? Because it uses streams. Because the availability of streams, it just makes that work. Same reason why you can include the files directly. PHP doesn't really care. It's just an included file, includes classes that I can cache. The only thing to remember is that everything goes through PHP. So if you're serving up a static file like a JavaScript file or whatnot, and it's not properly cached on the browser and such, it will always hit PHP. So there's the downside, is that static files go through PHP. Let's touch on security and some of the annoying bits. Like I showed you guys before, the read-only is enabled by default, and you need to disable it when you're actually writing the files. It means that no one can write into the files unless this has been changed. So fopen and such will not function properly without that being changed. So some of you guys might be aware of the Shuhosen security patch to PHP. It's enabled by default in Debian and Ubuntu. it will actually, it blacklisted FAR files. So in some cases, you might actually have to go in and whitelist FAR files. Signatures are used to check the integrity of the archives, and by that I mean there are some kind of functions to verify that the archives are okay, but it doesn't mean that they're absolutely safe. People can still manipulate them and change the hash, but that's the possibility with any kind of application out there. And the fact is, this is not a binary format, so people can actually look in there, and it's not completely safe, but it's helper functions to make. If you want to check the integrity of the file before you execute your program, you could. The signatures are as follows. You can use SSL keys to sign your application, MD5, SHA-1, and stronger encryptions. By default, FAR will sign SHA-1 if you don't define anything, unless you put a tar or a zip compression on it. Why? We would have to ask the maintainers. It is some oddity in there where they didn't want to put the signatures on tar and zip files, but you can. So if you define a signature up front, it will sign it regardless. Some extra goodies, and we're almost over. This is a really cool function, and there's a few other cool functions in FAR that you could look up, but this one is really cool. If you think about the PHP-myadmin example, anytime you use PHP-myadmin, there's a config file that you either need to manipulate or create. So what FAR mount can do is that if you drop a config.php file outside of the FAR file, you can tell it, mount that file, and if it doesn't exist, you can fall back on some default options. So you can actually mount external files into the FAR file. So that's great for configuration or specific data, JSON files, or so on. So it gives you a flexibility where you just give people, here's the FAR file with default options. Do you want to manipulate how it works? Just put a config file in that specific location, whatever that location is. Another cool one, FAR data. That's a really cool class in FAR. FAR archives can be extracted to disk through FAR data. It can operate on non-FAR files, gzip and tar, and zip files supposedly as well. It can extract and compress archives. And what that means, it is really similar in sense to PDO, but for archives. So you can actually start operating through a unified interface to deal with your all your compressed formats, to both create them and read from them. So through that kind of like, it's pretty much a hidden gem inside of FAR. So two useful tools I've used from time to time. FAR util, and it's available at github.com/far-util, or the Ampere. So one of them helps you with creating FAR files and doing the signatures. The other one is kind of a helper class that will help you do other cool stuff. They overlap a little bit, but they complement one another. So if you want to play around with FAR files a bit more, I would recommend looking into these two tools because they're really cool. So we're at the end of the talk and end of the 45 minutes. So if there are any questions.
Small question. Is it possible that if you allow neural and open on
Mm-hmm.
is it possible to just include a stream from your site, say if you want an API library, and include that stream, and you just use the library then?
I don't see any problems with it. I've never done it. But if you go to the next talk where Nils is doing the Composer talk, Composer has like checks to make sure all these, specifically that functionality, I think that works for them. So I'm pretty sure it works just fine. I haven't used all the scenarios in FAR, but I'm pretty sure it works, yeah. Could be, yeah. Yeah, so the question is, can you point Apache directly at the FAR file? Yes. You either have to change the file format or the file to .php or add .phar to the supported functionalities, as in you tell it .phar is a PHP file, so put it through mod PHP. So that's what I was doing there. I was actually pointing directly at the PHAR file.
And if you want to serve an entire application, you just do what you just said, register it as a MIME type, and then do rewrite rule, or?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you serve up the whole application? The only thing I do is I just point it directly to the PHAR file, and it just functions. It works just fine. Pretty URLs work just fine as well, as long as your application can handle it. So we're running out of time here, so you can hackle me or ask me questions at H. Email me any questions about PHAR, no problem. All the code is available here. And if you want to look at the slides afterwards, give me feedback or rate the talk, I would appreciate that a lot, and the organizers would as well. So you can go to Joined In and to 6255. So, and you can catch me afterwards as well to ask me any more questions. So thanks a lot, guys, for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.
DPC Radio is a production of iBuildings. The materials presented are copyright of the speakers. This episode is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 2.0 license. iBuildings is a full-service web development company specializing in PHP development. For more information on how we can help you with your next web project, visit our site at ibuildings.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again for DPC Radio.